Okay, welcome to SCI-Arc's Fall 1995 lecture series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Syrup, and I graduated from the embryonic SCI-Arc in 1979. I've been working in the Los Angeles area since then, doing stints in Eric Moss's office and partnering my own practice called Projects Architecture. And currently I'm working as a senior associate in Stephen Ehrlich's office. The reason I'm up here is I know Ben Ledbetter, a little bit anyway, and even though I haven't seen him for a long time, when he asked me to introduce him on this, which turns out to be his first trip to Southern California, I said, not a chance. But then he said he'd throw in dinner, so I'm here. Actually, it turns out, or it appears to be that there's an awful lot of people in the audience that know him, which I think is a good sign for SCI-Arc that it has a community that stretches well beyond the borders of Southern California. I think that's evident. So, Ben Ledbetter was raised in and around Mississippi, the deep south of William Faulkner and Tennessee Williams, and inherits a literary and theatrical legacy which pervades his work to this day. He studied industrial engineering at Mississippi State and received a Bachelor of Architecture from Auburn in 1972. Ledbetter Associates Architects was opened 4 years later in Corinth, Mississippi. I met Ben during the fall of 1982 at Harvard's Graduate School of Design when we were both students in the MArch II program. And I remember meeting him and thinking that I'd never met anybody up to that point in my life that spoke with a softer accent and wore, which at that time were revolutionary overalls. We both elected to take Stanley Tigerman's studio, which turned out to be a circus where one went in as a spectator and emerged as the performer. That was fueled with assigned existential philosophical readings which had to fuel the project. Ben ended up working on a performing arts school in Boston referencing Heidegger, and I worked out a genealogical archive center in Honolulu with Marcel Proust. Tigerman loved to encourage the dog-eat-dog, stab-in-the-back, cutthroat approach to architectural education. And every one of our crits was a one-on-one shootout, one student against the other. To use relevant gang terminology, at the last pinup, I took Ben out. And I'm afraid now it looks like he's invading my turf with an intellectual bazooka to even the score. Since graduating from the GSD in 1984, Ben's been heavily involved in academic pursuits, writing, entering competitions, and teaching at the likes of the Boston Architectural Center, Tulane University, Rhode Island School of Design, and his current position as assistant professor of art at Wesleyan University. He maintains a private architectural practice with his wife in Middleton, Connecticut, and has recently become involved in Architecture Theater Prometheus, a nonprofit urban foundation charged with exploring ways of engaging the inner city, which I understand will form the core of his talk tonight. The title of the lecture is Dead Mackerels in the Moonshine. So to speak to us not about the architecture of theaters, but the theater of architecture, without further ado, I would like to introduce Ben Ledbetter.
I just realized I sent Nick my old CV. I don't teach at Wesleyan anymore, and I'm now in New Haven, Connecticut, but other than some of the kudos, that was more or less accurate. How much of my time did he use? Thank you, Nick. Thank you, SCI-Arc. I was actually going to acknowledge that no one here really knew who I was, but I actually think I probably know more here than I don't know. But I do appreciate being invited here by all of you. As Nick said I spoke softly. He was kind and didn't say that I spoke very slowly. Or as Stanley Tigerman once said, you can't even say your name in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to speed up. I've had a lot of caffeine, and I understand from past experience, if not from warnings here, that I should try to get this in an hour. So I'm going to try to do what I usually don't like to do, and that's because I tend to stray into these strange anecdotes. I'm going to try to read my talk tonight. It's definitely a talk. Hopefully it might even become a conversation. It's not a lecture. Somebody call me on it if it starts sounding like a lecture. I did find out what a cross-continental flight is worth because as I got on the plane and realized that if I ad-libbed this lecture, I was going to be, where's my, someone was going to give me water. Thank you. Do you need that? I realized if I ad-libbed, I was going to be in deep trouble, so I completely rewrote my talk on the plane, which is what all these copious notes are. For those of you who don't know who I am, and part of the subject of what I'd like to try to say to you and try to ask you tonight, who I am is that I am every man. I am nobody. With some awkwardness, I'm trying to fashion a life as an architect from this double persona. And you, whether you know it or not, are here to bear witness to my plight. In the getting to know you mode, beyond Nick's introduction, tonight I want to show you 6 projects that I built from my practice when I was in Mississippi. Prior to a sabbatical from practice that I started in 1982 that God helped me lasted 12 years. I'm now out of that sabbatical, I hope, and for the past year I have been trying to just be an architect and be honest and all those things. After I show you these 6 projects, I will give you a brief interlude where I'll tell you what I think it was that I learned in graduate school and subsequently as a teacher. And then I will then show you some in-progress excerpts from a kind of a strange project that I began in 1992. And then I will conclude by showing you a few projects that Lawrence Blau, Deborah Friedman, and Ed Mitchell and I are working on in New Haven with occasional assistance from the likes of your own Nick Gillick, who worked on one of these projects that I will point out to you tonight. I can't see my notes for the microphone. I will show you some of the projects that we have in the hood in New Haven, which is where all of our work is somehow being directed. I'm going to tell you the story of 3 bears and a bear hunter. The bear hunter is also a magician and a maker of children's toys. And because I'm trying to figure out what it is I'm doing, I will occasionally read to you from 3 texts that I feel that I must try to understand if I'm ever going to come close to knowing what it is I'm trying to do. Those 3 texts are William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, Michel Desserteau's The Practice of Everyday Life, and a really wonderful, and you should read, full of wonder book that I read in a kind of pirated translation in the summer of 1980 when I was the architect for the 2 houses that you see here. That book is Octavio Paz's El Mono Grammatico, The Monkey Grammarian. The house on the left, I began working with these people in 1979, I think, maybe 1978. It's a house for John and Courtney Blossman in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. On the right, the house that I designed built, or I should say the addition that I designed built, which is this. I laid that foundation myself. that I designed and built with 4 high school juniors from Mississippi is in Blue Holler, West Virginia. And it is the house of Boogie, this is Boogie, and Vera White. And we built this addition one hot week in August in the summer of 1980. I've been thinking in retrospect that it's the distance between these two houses, both irritated and celebrated by what seems to me Octavio Paz's lucid explanation. This was in my reading in the summer of 1980. Octavio Paz's lucid explanation of what Peter Eisenman was talking about when I heard him, Peter Eisenman, lecture at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in the winter of the previous winter. It was that sort of recognition of the gap in that distance that in large measure has changed my architectural life. I don't want to tell you that Peter Eisenman changed my life, but that has changed my architectural life, that recognition since then. That change, as Nick was alluding to, was soon simplified for me by Stanley Tigerman, who taught the first studio that I took at Harvard with Nick in the fall of 1982, where I had gone to study with Peter, but where in some ways Stanley was my most important teacher. This kind of epiphany through Stanley came when he said, I can't really do Stanley, I'm not short enough, but something to the fact, life is fabulous, fabulous. If only architecture could be more like it. Stanley's critical appreciations, as Nick said, usually more for Nick than for me, were usually elaborated with praise like, holy shit, Ace, and little hand signs. And has Stanley Tigerman been out here? You should get Stanley Tigerman out here. A wonderful teacher. We won't talk about his architecture. This connection between life and architecture, which is so evident in the magic of the greatest architects of this century, and I should speak here for myself, first and foremost of Le Corbusier, is what tonight I would like to call architecture's innerness, I-N-N-E-R-ness, in case you don't understand my lingering accent. And it is particularly this innerness that you must hear when I speak later on tonight of the inner city that we are trying to work in New Haven and other places on the East Coast. So if you'll remember that. I'm troubled by this innerness and by the suppression of this innerness, not the absence, but the suppression of this innerness in the house on the right. Although I know that some of you might say, some critics might say that there's more suppression in the house on the left, but this is old projects for me. What I mean by that is that people like the Whites, Boogie and Vera, whether they're in Appalachia or in the South Bronx, are rarely, ever so rarely, given the attention of architects. I'm talking here about where power lies and about a civilized culture's priorities. You should also read into my bumbling through this talk and my bumbling through trying to figure out what it is that we're doing in New Haven. And you may even accuse this bumbling as gratuitous attempts at addressing this lack in the images that I will show you in New Haven, though I hope not. I would also ask you to try to remember, I'm going to show you this image again at the end of the talk, and I'd like for you to remember the color scheme here. I'm going to show you a previous image of the same house. Let's see if I can work these. They don't work at the same time. I'm going to show you in these projects that were prior to my sabbatical, what I thought I was trying to get at, that at the time I didn't call innerness, but in retrospect I can try to put that label on these. In some ways, what seemed to me very sophomoric or naive attempts at this, which is why one goes to graduate school, right? The shot on the left is an interior of the same house, of the Blossman's house. The house on the right is the rear elevation. I was trying to work through some admittedly formal maneuvers that were trying to unravel, if not some of the secrets of the house, some of the relationships I had to the clients and some of my understandings of the client's own innerness. Here, by just simply operating on the house, if you remember from the previous, actually you couldn't see on the front elevation, there's a negative piece for this positive, so that this whole thing gets pushed through the house here, and where the two apses of the house intersect, the house unravels a bit, stylistically unravels. This is another project of about the same time. Can you focus the one on the right? Should I just let you focus? Okay. This is a small community center and daycare center in the town that I was practicing in Mississippi. This is a house that's actually a block away from the daycare center. I'll let you decide what I was playing with there. Hopefully playing is not too much of a pejorative. Here, working with a 9-square grid, this is a public county health department building, and again in the same town in Mississippi, sort of taking it apart diagonally across the axis of the 9 squares and working with the residual of that incision. One of my favorite clients were a group of bankers in Mississippi who came to me with a notion that banks look like this. This is Louis Sullivan's image from Kindergarten Chats, which he lambasted far more than I will tonight. A bank had columns, or as Flem Snope said, columns, extra big ones, and a pediment. It was Greek revival, of course. What happens is that the context of this particular bank, which is that it's on a highway running through the town with a cotton mill across the street, begins to spin that pediment around the site a bit. So if you sort of turn your head cattywonkers, you'll find the pediment. And as that spinning occurs with the pediment, there's concomitant unraveling of pediments and other things on the inside of the bank. I was reading a lot of Uncle Billy at this time, William Faulkner on the left. Everyone from Mississippi calls Faulkner Uncle Billy. I was reading him when we got a call about a possible commission in Oxford, Mississippi, which was Faulkner's Jefferson, Mississippi of Yoknapatawpha County. And we were very excited about this, but we had sort of heard through the grapevine that this was a gratuitous invitation and that we had no chance of getting this project. But we decided to go anyway, and a guy that was working with me at the time, George Johnson, and I got in the car and got to Oxford in time to have a few beers before this meeting, because we'd been reading our Faulkner and we were going to let it all hang out as it was. These were bankers that were both townspeople and farmers very much the Compsons and Snopeses, a really interesting mix of Faulkner, all very wonderful people, who had invited us to make a presentation about doing this bank. And they, of course, wanted a bank. These guys really wanted a bank that looked like the bank in Chicago, but really a bank that looked like Faulkner's house, this image on the right, and the house of the Compsons in Faulkner's work. A bank that spoke of the tradition of banks, and a bank that spoke of traditions of architecture in the South. What the board was trying to do, I tried to convince them at this meeting, as I remember, I quoted from Wallace Stevens, and I read this passage from As I Lay Dying. What I was trying to tell them was that what they were doing was looking for a name for the bank, rather than a real understanding or real attempt to deal with what the bank was. You know, the kind of things you say when you're 20-something years old and trying to be an architect in Mississippi. But this is what I read them that Addie Bundren said about naming things. She's talking about her husband here, Addie is. He had a word too, love he called it. But I had been used to words for a long time. I knew that the word was like all the others, just a shape to fill a lack. That when the right time came, you wouldn't need a word for that any more than for pride or fear. And then later, Addie says, I would think about a name until after a while I could see the word as a shape, a vessel, and I would watch it liquefy and flow into it like cold molasses flowing out of the darkness into the vessel, until the jar stood full and motionless, a significant shape profoundly without life like an empty door frame. And then I would find that I had forgotten the name of the jar. Now, while I was reading this, and I was for me, fairly animated and was standing up and carrying on at this table of bankers and farmers, there was this guy, swear to God, in a John Deere cap sitting across from me. He was chewing tobacco and spitting the juice into a Coca-Cola bottle. And he kept the tobacco in his mouth, but he stopped chewing when I started talking, and he sat back from the table like this, and looked at me the whole time that I was talking, and was really terrifying me, but I had had a couple of buds, and so I kept going. So when I finished this, I was about to leave, and assuming I was going to get my thank yous, don't call us, we call you. And the guy looked at the man in the John Deere cap had been looking at another man across the table from him. And when I finished speaking, he looked around and slapped the table and said, by God, I vote we hire these boys. And we talked about the conditions of that hiring. But then when I was leaving, he sort of sidled up to me and said, I guess you know why I voted we hire you, don't you? I said, no, I was really going to ask you that. I was a little bit curious. And he said, well, after all them incantations you were performing, all that poetry you was reading, I was afraid that if Williams didn't hire you, you was going to put a hex on us. So that was one of my best commissions. And this is the bank. I tried to put a hex on them. These are the only two classical columns I've ever put in a building. As my friend Sam Motby says, they're the only two classical columns Ledbetter ever did, and he didn't get the damn things to match. What this is my own sort of, this building actually backs up to the houses that Faulkner writes about, and what it is kind of dumbly kind of unraveling of the house and taking the porch with Flem Snopes' columns, which are no longer extra big, separating them and sliding one to the back, leaving one at the front, and opening the porch to Faulkner's rear yard, to his possibilities for kitchen talk, as he called it. These are the first two bears that I'm going to tell you about. These are, about this time, I decided that what was going on in architecture, this is as I was trying to understand what Peter Eisenman was saying, remember, is that these were the two models for mainstream architectural production. On the left, a simulation of history. On the right, a simulation of history's disguises, or disguises of history. And also a potential kind of third model, which maybe fits the one on the right. It seemed to me it was a kind of dumb, old-fashioned dilettantist formalism, all of which, it seemed to me, in the waning years of 1981, just wouldn't do. I was also reading another poet at this time, short quote. There's a formal poetry, perfect only in form, all dressed up and nowhere to go. The number of syllables, the designated and required stresses of accent, the rhymes if wanted, they come off with the skill of a solved crossword puzzle. Yet its animation and connotation are less than that of a dead mackerel in the moonshine. The latter, even as an extinct form, reporting that once it was a living fish aswim in bright waters. So, with all of that in my craw, I went off to Harvard in the fall of 1982. And this is what I learned at Harvard that architecture might be. I'm actually, some knucklehead at Harvard asked me to be on the alumni council there. And I went to my first meeting a couple of weeks ago, and you know, they're not teaching this at Harvard anymore. It's very odd. Anyway, I'm still trying to play this piano. So, graduate school, my 12-year sabbatical, and here's where I am now. This is where I am personally. This is actually not an office project. It's not a project of the foundation. This is my own personal project where I'm trying to resolve, in a way, I'm trying to come to an understanding of Boogie and Vera White's house in Appalachia. So I'm going to show you some of the tunes that I'm trying to play, and I would actually sincerely like to know how you think they sound. I'm told that SCI-Arc students usually don't ask questions after talks. I'd really like for you to ask questions, or not literally throw things, but figuratively throw things. And I'd like to talk about what you think about all of this, if there's time. And now I'm going to try to speed up. This is a work that is a house play in book that attempts to occupy the space between what really happens in a small house in New London, Connecticut, and how those lives were represented by one of their characters, or one might say one of their victims. The characters are Eugene O'Neill, his brother Jamie O'Neill, his father James, and his mother, the real hero, heroine of the play Long Day's Journey into Night, Ella Quinlan O'Neill. This is the house that was the setting in memory of O'Neill's play Long Day's Journey into Night, which many of you know, I'm sure. And this is a photograph of the first set of the play. And again, what this thing that I'm working on is, this crazy project, is an attempt in architecture and in writing and in theater, to occupy the gap between those two, as it were. A student of mine at Wesleyan had a grant in the summer that I started working on this project, which was for 3 years ago, to work with me documenting the house. These are the drawings that the student did. He did a drawing of every room, but particularly detailed drawings of the 2 rooms that showed up in the set of the play. And this is a kind of a photo archaeology of, I think, literally hundreds of contact sheets of photographs of the house. As I tried to move through the house, as the characters might have moved through the house and touched the things, at least in photographs, that the characters might have touched. The playbook house is also an attempt to occupy the space between the play and the different records of the play and the script of the play and Sidney Lumet's film, Long Day's Journey into Night, with the hero-heroine Ella Quinlan O'Neill, Mary Tyrone in the play, played by Katharine Hepburn. On the right is one of the drawings that is beginning to come out of this thing that I'm doing. This is, let's see. This is a drawing of O'Neill's writing stand and Ella's or Mary's weaver. This is a weaving machine and a writing stand for the young poet playwright. This is an interesting drawing to me because this thing exists in 2 different spaces and in 2 different times. The weaver occurs in both the history and the play of the summer of 1912 in New London, Connecticut. The writing stand occurs in a house outside of San Francisco in 1941 where O'Neill was writing Long Day's Journey into Night. On the left is the window, and I won't go into it. If you know the play, you'll get some sense maybe of what these are about. On the left is Mary's or Ella's window in her room, her retreat. And on the right is her room with the 2 stairs up, which don't occur in the house. 1 stair occurs in the house. But the 2 stairs up, Mary's stair on the left and the boys' stair on the right. 3 boys, all of them boys, really. So that's a project that's in progress and probably will be to the day I die. Even though Harvard Architecture Review decided they were going to excerpt it in the Harvard Architecture Review that's coming supposedly in 2 more issues. It's somehow prophetic that as soon as they told me that they were going to print it, they went belly up and there is no more Harvard Architecture Review. This is a project that we started, and Nick Gilbert worked on this project with us, that we started last year as a kind of prelude to the work that we're doing in New Haven. What we wanted to do was to look away from New Haven as a way of understanding what we might be doing there. So we entered the competition that Atlanta had, that the Atlanta Society of Architects and the Olympic Committee had a year ago, to build sites in anticipation of the 1996 Olympics, but also sites that would stay in the city and offer a kind of reasoning for what the city is about then and now. This is one of the sites of the 4 that were given. It's the site that we chose that is, it appeared to us, pretty much in the heart of the city. As we began to dig into a kind of an archaeology of the site, we found out that just out of this picture, right about here down the street, was the first boarding house in the city of Atlanta and also the first 2-story building in the city of Atlanta. And it seemed somehow prophetic to us, and it seemed even more prophetic when we found out that this is quite literally the origin of the city. And if you know Atlanta, it's the site in the city where underground Atlanta begins. This is the original datum of the city. This is the new datum of the city. This is Atlanta as it was prior to underground Atlanta, and this is almost literally that same site today. The new datum is up here, and as you saw in the previous slide, is not particularly more inviting than underground Atlanta, although parts of it have been turned into chi-chi shops. So the boarding house for us became, in a way, the project. It was interesting to us, particularly because the boarding house seemed to us a kind of parable for the city, where there were public spaces, shared spaces, but also private spaces, and also spaces between strangers. You could live next to someone in a boarding house and not know who that person was. Very different from living in a house or even being in a building together, in some kind of mercantile building. So what we did was to take what seemed to me an archetypal boarding house, the boarding house that Thomas Wolfe lived in when he wrote Look Homeward, Angel. And we began to try to, because we couldn't find any records of the previous boarding house, we began to try to understand the kind of interiority, the kind of inner lives of the boarders, and to try to figure out where they went, in a way, to try to figure out how they, which also the previous slide was trying to figure out where the boarders went to. How is it that space that is the memory of the city is remembered? On the left is the lighting of the lamp of the Confederacy. On the right is the new city, circa 1929, is played out by the four characters, or the four boarders who would come to occupy our boarding house. These characters were the doughboy. This is from a costume ball in 1929, where these people were trying to talk about what was happening in Atlanta at the time. A doughboy, a Spanish caballero, the pig woman, and Atlanta ahead. The pig woman was witness to a murder trial that had fascinated the nation in 1929. It was actually occurring in New Jersey. And I don't have time to go into the sordid details of what that was about, but you could imagine. In the historical space of the city, is the historical space of the city ossified as here in the Lion of the Confederacy sleeping on its arms? And if it is, how strong is its grip? The third bear in my story is the living bear whose voice is muzzled, his dance highly choreographed. This is the last dancing bear to ever walk or dance the streets of Atlanta. On the right is a Civil War encampment in the city. This and a whole sort of slew of these kinds of studies were our attempt to try to loosen memory's grip, to try to understand the grip of memory, and in a sense, to dance with the bear. We wanted our boarders to be workers in the city. Here, an historical worker, a knife sharpener, if none of you know what this is, and here a street vendor on the contemporary streets of Atlanta. Our boarders definitely had to be workers in the city. And they had to be storytellers in the city, as much storytellers as Joel Chandler Harris sitting on his porch on the left in Atlanta. And as much storytellers as we tried to be as we began to try to understand who these four boarders were, again, gathering from this kind of archaeology of place. These are both the boarders and the rooms that would occupy in some fashion the site. The site was also the edge of the last vestige of wilderness in Atlanta. It was the last it was just to the left of that photograph I showed you, was the previous penultimate Oglethorpe Park, which was the last park in the middle of the city, which is now a double-tiered parking lot and a walk-up McDonald's. So it occurred to us that these boarders would probably try to flee to the woods, and when the woods weren't there, they would flee to whatever they found. What this is a right-angle game of what's a 300-year-old tree in Atlanta that's now endangered. The sort of thing on All Things Considered the other day, that they've put a stop on the state tearing it down. But it's one of the trees that is endangered in the city. And so that tree, in a sense, the image of its imminent demise becomes the edge of the site. This is, in fact, the street that ran through the site in the previous. This street is this street. And this is where the park was. And this was the site as given to us by the Atlanta Society of Architects in this competition. And this is our entry to the competition. So what these workers did was that they became actors in a play about the city, and also boarders in the boarding house. And they lived in this boarding house as by a kind of sweat equity that's actually modeled on Habitat, which is centered in Atlanta, Jimmy Carter's Habitat. But the sweat equity for being able to live in this boarding house was that they would be actors in this play. Here are the 4 rooms. This is the, let me have to get them straight. The boarders were played by 4 characters who played in the kind of costume bazaar that I showed you the previous image for. And they were given kind of characterizations as they found new rooms in the site, as the taxidermist, the keeper of the Olympic flame, the playwright, and the stripper. And I was going to read you some excerpts from the play, but I'm just going to have to keep going. When the boarders fled the now abandoned boarding house, traces of their flight are left on its exterior. They act out relationships daily on a cyclical basis. They live in their rooms. They change in dressing tents behind the rooms, and they go to their daily positions after breakfast here in the displaced dining room, which is now in the center of the street and buried. Here's the pig woman, who is the accuser or witness who wanders the site. Atlanta Head is sitting in the abandoned boarding house at his drawing board. The keeper of the Olympic flame stands here and opens and closes this curtain all day long. This piece, as a lot of these pieces, were built by Nick Gilbert. Some of this is falling apart, Nick. Yeah. There's a buried upside-down oil tank in the center of the street, which is where the audience goes when they're not milling about in the street, where they go to hear the conversation in the dining room. This is not making any sense without reading the play, but you just don't have time to listen to it. So if any of you are interested, you can ask me later. When we tried to think of the site urbanistically, one of the things we had to do was to keep the streets functioning so the cars still move about the site in the same pattern that they did before. But it's also important, thinking of the site urbanistically, that the the rooms that were embedded in this wall became, in a sense, sort of Baudelarian flowers that could collapse together into a single flower from the right perspective, the right urban perspective. So I'm taking you much too quickly to suit me to New Haven. The role of our foundation in New Haven is given to us by our benefactors, who are all Yale alumni, is to grapple with the problems of the city. And I could go on and on about what that means, but you sort of get the drift. We took this charge when we were given it a year ago, when we began the work of the foundation, to City Hall, and were given a neighborhood in the city to work in. And though we've been working outside this neighborhood, the remainder of the work that I'm going to show you is from this first community that we started working in, which is called Cedar Hill in New Haven. It seemed to us right off the bat that these were the two modes that people seem to adopt in living in the city. The first project that we began to work on in this neighborhood was a youth center. And the meeting here on the right is a photograph from the New Haven Register of what we were doing was looking at this building and trying to find a way to put this youth center, whatever it was going to be, into the building. The three kids here, I say kids, they call them kids, the three youth here, young men here, were all newly renovated from life on the street in New Haven, so the story goes. And they were very interested in kind of finding a new life in this youth center. This is Ron Cohens, who is a city architect in New Haven that we've been working with on a lot of projects, and this is one of the aldermen in the city. Well, when this photograph hit the papers, it turns out that Eddie here, if some of you don't know, is giving the sign for Latin King Solidarity. The city fathers saw the photograph in the paper and they yanked the project, and there is no more Fairhaven, which is Cedar Hill Youth Center. It's something that we're trying to rejuvenate in different kinds of projects. But you want a little story about politics. The Cedar Hill itself is a fairly small neighborhood that was actually chopped up when Interstate 91 was swathed through the city in the early 1960s. It was a railroading community, actually a very vibrant blue-collar community in the city that is now given away to a great deal of abandonment and a great deal of strange misuse of, some could say misuse or odd use of what were mercantile spaces. This is a kind of charge that we took, and I'm going to have to curtail some of my quotes I see, but I'd like to read this one letter to you. This is Michel Desserteau's introduction to the practice of everyday life. It's called To the Ordinary Man, to a common hero and ubiquitous character walking in countless thousands on the streets. In invoking here at the outset of my narratives the absent figure who provides both their beginning and their necessity, I inquire into the desire whose impossible object he represents. What are we asking this oracle, whose voice is almost indistinguishable from the rumble of history, to license us, to authorize us to say, when we dedicate to him the writing that one formerly offered in praise of the gods or the inspiring muses? This anonymous hero is very ancient. He is the murmuring voice of societies. In all ages, he comes before texts, T-E-X-T-S, I have trouble with that word. He does not expect representations. He squats now at the center of our scientific stages. The floodlights have moved away from the actors who possess proper names and social blazons, turning first toward the chorus of secondary characters, then settling on the mass of the audience. The increasingly sociological and anthropological perspective of inquiry privileges the anonymous and the everyday, in which zoom lenses cut out metonymic details, parts taken from the whole. Slowly, the representatives that formerly symbolize families, groups, and orders disappear from the stage they dominated during the epoch of the name. We witness the advent of the number. It comes along with democracy, the large city, administration, cybernetics. It is a flexible and continuous mass, woven tight like a fabric with neither rips nor darned patches, a multitude of quantified heroes who lose names and faces as they become the ciphered river of the streets, a mobile language of computations and rationalities that belong to no one. For the inhabitants of the inner city, our thesis becomes, with homage to Dessler, that the presence and circulation of a representation, one taught by architects, preachers, educators, and popularizers as the key to socioeconomic advancement, tells us nothing about what it is for its users. We must first analyze its manipulation by users who are not its makers. This is very important for architects, it seems to us, architects in the inner city. Only then can we gauge the difference or similarity between the production of the image and the secondary production hidden in the process of its utilization. Again, from Dessler, the approach to culture begins when the ordinary man becomes the narrator, when it is he who defines the commonplace of discourse and the anonymous space of its development. The task, the goal for the maker, consists not in substituting a representation for the ordinary or covering it up with mere words, we should remember our first two bears, but in showing how it introduces itself into our techniques as architects, in the way in which the sea flows back into pockets and crevices in beaches, and how it can reorganize the place from which discourse is produced. This reorganizing of the place from which discourse is produced is a highly political agenda for architects and urbanists, and one that we're trying to figure out how to engage. This seems to us the whole point of this kind of future understanding of where power lies in the making of the city. Yep. Was this slide just up, or did I miss it? You haven't been looking at this, have you? Oh, have you? Oh, well. These are a couple of maps that, kind of literal dumb maps that we began to try to understand the neighborhood with, and away from the eyes of those who have only been able to see it through these kind of dumb maps, i.e. urbanist, a kind of know thine enemy, a kind of know thine Robert Moses, if you will. This is the neighborhood. It actually did extend all the way down to here. You see what I-91 did to it. Here's the railroad that binds it on one side, and there's a mountain that binds it on this side that looks like this. It's called East Rock. There's a monument up here that you'll see in a minute. And this is this guy, Ed Mitchell, who does these computer things. I don't do these things. I'm not comfortable with this, but Ed does these wonderful things with them very quickly, and this is a way of kind of understanding patterns of growth and development in the neighborhood. These two images lie about 1,000 feet apart to give you some notion of the poignancy that lies in this neighborhood. Both of them exist on that same map, and that you couldn't tell, I'm sure you couldn't, that they would lie in the map is part of the point of this indictment against that particular kind of mapping. The neighborhood is known as a center for buying automobile parts in New Haven, Connecticut. Here's the new Napa dealership on the left, right across the street from that previous mercantile strip that I told you about. It's actually one of my favorite buildings in New Haven. It is also an area in New England critical to the migratory patterns of birds, East Rock being critical to the migratory patterns of birds. And it's the home of the Erector set and more storefront churches per capita than any other neighborhood in the city. This is A.C. Gilbert on the left, world record bear hunter, magician, maker of the Erector set, and author of his autobiography, The Man Who Lived in Paradise. Paradise, of course, being what Cedar Hill is decidedly not about now, and very much what the man who's advertised on the right would like to see it as being. That was a storefront church quote. We're working on some kind of traditional kinds of schemes, urban schemes for the city. This is a parking scheme behind the mercantile strip where these kinds of storage things slide in and out of the spaces between the merchants and bury themselves in the parking lot that might go to the rear. But what we're more interested in is than parking for the merchants is what is it that's being sold here? What is it that's being lived here? I'm going to give you a quick visual tour of the neighborhood. Two quick quotes, one from the poet Jacques Saucher. And I forgot the element of chance introduced by circumstances, calm or haste, sun or cold, dawn or dusk, the taste of strawberries or abandonment. The half-understood message, the front page of newspapers, the voice on the telephone, the most anodyne conversation, the most anonymous man or woman, everything that speaks, makes noise, passes by, touches us lightly, meets us head on. And a brief reading from the Monkey Grammarian. Is this repose the force that prevents the trees from fleeing and the sky from falling apart? Is it the gravity of this moment? Yes, I am well aware that nature, or what we call nature, that totality of objects and processes that surround us and that alternately creates and devours us. That, by the way, I think is Frank Lloyd Wright's definition of nature, so infamously butchered by his followers, is neither our accomplice nor our confidant. It is not proper to project our feelings onto things or to attribute our own sensations and passions to them. Can it also be improper to see in them a guide, a way of life? To learn the art of remaining motionless amid the agitation of the whirlwind, to learn to remain still and to be transparent as this fixed light amid the frantic branches, this may be a program for life. This is my favorite store in Cedar Hill, the Costume Bazaar. I need a focus on the right. Focus Harold. This is Harold of the Costume Bazaar. Harold is, as I take this photograph, admonishing me to listen to him. To him. He tells me that he is the common man. His window is the common man's window. And I was going to play that and some other things, but my tape player doesn't seem to cooperate with your microphone. we should listen to the voices of the community. This is my favorite one, the doctor and singer. This painted by a group of kids who are working with Act One players, young kids that we're not working with, but who are working with the theater group that we're working with high school kids. Marine liquor store on the left, the proprietor, whose name is Boo, on the right. All of this knowledge has a price for the architect. I went to this is Ralph's Beauty Shop on the left. This is Ralph and a customer on the right. I went in to see Ralph, and lapsing momentarily into the objectologist fascination that I have with things, particularly these things over here. I was talking to Ralph about these, and I was told that I could only photograph them if he would let me correct that god-awful haircut, quote unquote. I walk around Cedar Hill with this look on my face most of the time, by the way. My wife gave me that haircut. Behind the bars of this fake antique store, American Flag Antiques. It's a lie. It's not an antique store at all. Behind the bars of this fake antique store, I discovered Cedar Hill's own Museum of Jurassic Technology, proprieted by Thomas Edison's great-grandson. And it's full of these strange, not as strange as the Museum of Jurassic, not as strange as Mr. Wilson's museum perhaps. But if you know David Sloan, it's very strange. These shrines to his grandfather, which are opened only to the privileged few, are in the front of this store. And in the back room, he writes books about Mark Twain. I've been reading a lot of Studs Terkel lately on how one is honest to a client, how one is honest to one's profession of listening. And part of that, there's this whole kind of circle that we find ourselves in, trying to make relationships in the neighborhood. Dave introduced us to the woman who's the proprietor of Bess's Boutique, who, as Dave says, and I was also going to play with my tape recorder, is a wonderful, quote, roly-poly church lady. She's actually a quite wonderful roly-poly church lady, but she also has some very interesting ideas about what the neighborhood needs in relation to the way she lives in the neighborhood and makes things in the neighborhood. She makes she makes choir robes. She told me that I should make for Cedar Hill the way she makes her choir robes. Each robe takes 2.5 days to make. We're working now on 2, interestingly for us, similar projects in the neighborhood. We are working on a meeting hall for the Neighborhood Block Watch Association. Here you see meeting on the left. And we're working on a project that we call City School, which is a kind of arm of our foundation. That's our foundation working with a group called Act One Players, a group that's been doing kind of mediation with teenagers from inner city high schools in the neighborhood. On the right are sites in the neighborhood that the kids we're working with selected because of the ways they form certain kinds of borders between public and private space in relation to the way they lived in this neighborhood. We tour these archetypal, first we actually tour archetypal boundaries between public and private space downtown, such as the city green, the downtown mall, the downtown sidewalks with the kids. I'm going to walk you through the phase of city school that we're working on now. Then we tour Cedar Hill with the kids. There are 14 of them in a group that we're working with now. They construct monologues working with Tony Moss, a back one players, and with us sort of to the side, about selected individual spaces in their neighborhood, and move eventually toward representation of these monologues in visuals that we construct with them, which is what you see we're doing here. So that this is actually a gate between an old gate that's been closed off in the park. We went with the kids. One of them found this site, talked about the gate, talked about the graffiti. I'll let you intuit what's going on. This was the gate that acted as scissors in kind of an earlier scheme that ends up as this. I'm not saying that the kids make these, but I'm not saying that we make them either. We make these with the kids. This is the monument on top of East Rock. Some of these things are named. In fact, the last three sites that I'm going to show you move further towards some kind of architectural resolution that I will show you. This is a site for a play that was written by one of the kids called Concrete Island. If any of you have read J.G. Ballard, you know where that's coming from. This is one of the hottest drug dealing corners in New Haven because it's right next to I-91. Easy on, easy off. One-stop shopping. And this was a really interesting kind of take that one of the kids had with some goading about the absence of the front porches of these houses, how what was once a place where community actually occurred had become a liquor store and an abandoned store in this instance. The kids then write plays bridging these monologues to the site representations, which I showed you there. This is my partner in this madness with Act One players. This is Tony Moss. And this is a workshop at one of the local high schools where the four kids on the left here are performing the colors of four sites along one block in the street, including the sounds of the colors. The girl here is the audience and is trying to read what these colors are. Objects from the neighborhood are brought back, objects from these sites are brought back to serve as props, which is short for properties, which is interesting, along with made images. Plays are written around, over, and through these things. Some preliminary mapping. This is Ed, got one of these kids on the computer, and Ed swears that he did this, but I think he swears the kid did this, but I think Ed did this. This is the floor plan of the space that we're using for this theater, which is a storefront here with an alley in the rear and a restroom. Kind of a hodgepodge of the existing elevation. The kids are bringing these objects back to this space. And they're woven sort of through putting all this stuff up, both the objects and these representations, these collages up on the wall, having stored them in this space here. These are blocking diagrams of three of the plays. This is a play called, that I showed you the site earlier from, called Concrete Island, which is about eminent domain, interestingly enough. This is the blocking diagram in the space for a play called The Diviner, whose sole actor has two parts, that of a drug dealer and that of a diviner who's searching for the mundus of the city. That particular project has turned into we're trying to turn these toward urban propositions about the city. That particular project, based on some images of archaeological digging that we've been talking to the kids about, paired with a kind of photographic survey we did of an abandoned, actually I did these photographs with one of the kids on one of the abandoned sites in the neighborhood, a kind of photographic survey of that, has turned into this project where we're taking a number of these objects, and both objects from the site and also objects that are somehow important to the neighborhood. This is from a pictorial encyclopedia that one of the kids had of car parts. A shoe that was found on the site that is in one of these photographs, the making of the shoe. Again, Ed and some of the kids on the computer. We're trying to, here's the shoe. That's the object. The center object is the object. This neighborhood was also on the edge of a kind of an oyster farm on Long Island Sound. So these are some of the fishing nets. Trying to understand the place both through its history and through what you find there. So what this has turned into is, this is on the side of the diviner, drug dealer corner. What this has turned into is that Lawrence Blau made these things, but the kids are making some of these things too. These are objects that are going to go, the drug dealer's corner is right next to this bodega in town, and the kids have talked to the merchant, and he's going to start, other than cornflakes that he's selling inside and cocaine that's being sold outside the store, he's going to start but appearing to sell these objects that are going to be, actually one of these made out of, this one's chipboard, one of these made out of Strathmore is actually sitting on the shelf in this bodega next to a box of Kellogg's cornflakes. And this wonderful thing. I'm getting there. This third play is called Real Estate Bingo. This is the play that's about the missing porches that have turned into these kind of havens for merchants. This missing porch is actually taken as a parable for the headquarters for the Blockwatch Association. We've talked a lot about why these porches are needed and why they're missed and why ideas about community might occur in and on them. I've got two slides showing up at once on the right. I've got two slides in the same slot somehow. Can that be fixed? I guess that's what happened. Are there two slides together? Or is one just stuck down in there? That's not it. That's good. It's another image that looks like this one that I'm looking for, but a close-up. This is an idea about collapsing these three plays into a simultaneous production. The three plays that I showed you previously, the blocking diagrams, are individual stories about individual relationships to boundaries of public and private space in the neighborhood. The idea here is to collapse these into a collective performance, the notion being that in this palimpsest of city stories lies perhaps our closest approximation yet, anyway, of what lives lived together in the city might be. How are you doing? On the right, I need the photograph, the black and white photograph of that building. My mannerisms of speech are my fault. This is not my fault. I wonder if I could do it with just the slides on the left. Well, I'll go a little bit ahead and read a quote to you from Octavio Paz. That's a little bit about our method for the last project that I'm going to show you, I promise, which is the headquarters for the Neighborhood Block Watch Association. This is the way we are trying to understand our method for this project as we're making it. It is necessary to unweave even the simplest phrases in order to determine what it is that they contain, figurative expressions, parentheses, and what they are made of and how. What is language made of? And most important of all, is it already made or is it something that is perpetually in the making? Unweave the verbal fabric, reality will appear. Two metaphors. Can reality be the reverse of the fabric, the reverse of metaphor, that which is on the other side of language? Language has no reverse, no opposite faces, no right or wrong. Perhaps reality, too, is a metaphor of what and or of whom. Perhaps things are not things but words, metaphors, words for other things. With whom and of what do word things speak? I'm almost done here, I promise. By means of a succession of patient analyses, again, Octavio Paz on method, and in a direction that is the opposite of that of the normal activity of the speaker, whose function is to produce and construct phrases, whereas here it is a question of taking them apart and uncoupling them, deconstructing them, so to speak. I read this from Paz in 1980. We ought to make our way back upstream against the current, retrace our path, and proceeding from one figurative expression to another, arrive back at the root, the original, primordial word for which all others are metaphors. Now, sorry for that little detour. This notion of watching the lives of the city simultaneously, seeing the lives of the city simultaneously, in a sense we adopted for the program for the Block Watch headquarters, which is this very small storefront in this building on the main street of Cedar Hill. And this is when we were actually beginning to use the space, but haven't started any of the work on the space yet. Hope this works. That's upside down and also the wrong slide. There should be a close-up of this one that goes over here next. This is also, in a way, the Block Watch Association, for those of you who don't know what Block Watch Associations are, is a kind of visual monitoring of a neighborhood, particularly a neighborhood that's in, a neighborhood that's in some kind of trouble. The missing porches somehow become very important to that, since that absence in some way speaks of the inability of a neighborhood to take care of itself. Let's see if this is right. Yep. Okay, method. You should have seen these when I was reading Octavio Paz on his notion of deconstructing a place. The association watches, but also gives back to the neighborhood gifts. Sort of Lewis Hyde's notion of gifts. Gifts of its watchfulness. Recordings of reported incidents are reified in welded steel in this project in selected occurrences. So this is a simulation of an assembly that would accrue over time as these incidents occur and are reported to the Block Watch Association. This part, the exterior portion of the project is being funded by a grant from the city, a SCI-Arc grant. Note the marking on the side of the building for the porch. The interior of the space is funded by the Block Watch Association itself. And what the interior is a meeting room and overhead screen that shows images of the neighborhood through the front window. So if you're standing in front, you see these images of the neighborhood. They're taken by the Block Watch Association. As these incidents accumulate, the view into the space will gradually be obliterated by this accumulation of welded steel pieces. Faulkner's Addie Bundren. I would think how words go straight up in a thin line, quick and harmless, and how terribly doing goes along the earth, clinging to it, so that after a while the two lines are too far apart for the same person to straddle from one to the other, and that sin and love and fear are just sounds that people who never sinned nor loved nor feared have for what they never had and cannot have until they forget the words. I have 4 more slides, 2 more pairings as a kind of coda. This is the house that I showed you in the first slide, the 2 houses I showed you in the first slide. Just in case you think this kind of weird fascination I have with colors is some new occurrence, this was the original paint scheme for the house. This was on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I also didn't say that this is in a town where Bruce Goff has 2 houses, Frank Lloyd Wright has 1, and Louis Sullivan has 1. So I flew down from northern Mississippi to the Mississippi Gulf Coast one day, and what we decided to do with the paint after going back and forth and spending a lot of time looking at paint colors was to put one coat of paint on the house, and I would fly down and we'd talk about it. So I went down and spent the day I took this photograph. I had some rereadings of this, but I was basically ecstatic with the way the colors were working out. I was sitting at dinner with John and Courtney Blossman that night, and I was looking at John and talking to him, and I heard Courtney was saying something, and her voice began to break, and I looked at her, and she was just boo-hooing. She was hysterical, and she said, "I can't live with those goddamn colors." And so we revised the color scheme. She said that she'd just spent all day holding it back because she didn't want to hurt my feelings. One quick story about the house on the right, about things not appearing to be as they are. When we had spent a week working for the Whites in Appalachia, the kind of conversation that I've been able to get into with the people in Cedar Hill was something we were really hoping for here, but we never went into the house. Mrs. White was an invalid, as you can see. He's sort of propping her up here to tell us goodbye. And he never invited us into the house. And we were very worried about this, the kids and I, and sort of upset by it. And we didn't say anything to him, but as we were telling him goodbye, he sort of realized from what we were saying that we were somehow saddened by this. And he said, no, you've got it wrong. I really wanted to let you in the house, but I've got this dog. The dog had been coming to the door when we'd go to the door to talk to him. I've got this dog who was, I don't know if these people were early Tom Waits fans or not, but they had a dog that was a Chihuahua named Carlos. And I think the dog was probably nearly blind, and he only just growled at me. And he said, I would have let you into the house, but my dog, he wants to bite you. So things are not always as they appear. Thank you for having me to SCI-Arc. If any of you are still with me and have any questions about any of this, I'd love to try to answer them or to talk about them. Can you turn up the lights? Yes? No? Questions? Hey, Nick, you have a question? Moe. This is Debbie Friedman's great uncle who's asking this question. As you probably know, she spends a lot of time these days taking care of 2 little children, so she's not spending as much time on these projects as she would like to, I think. But some valuable consultation. You have a question, Nick? Okay, thank you.